Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I know the hour is late. I'll try and keep it short.
It
just
is
for supplementary questions. Firstly, the first two are actually questions of my speech. I don't think the minister answered them unless I missed them. So the first one is really the subject of a Part 3 direction or POL declaration can apply within a 30-day time frame to the minister for an appeal for reconsideration. But does the minister have a time frame within which he must respond on that, and would the minister commit to that? The second question is really relating to Clause 93. Those who are designated as PSPs or PSEs issued directives under Parts 5 and 6 may only appeal against that decision to the minister. They have no right to appeal to the tribunal, I believe, unlike those who are issued Part 3 directions. So what is the basis for that? The third question is really in relation to what the minister mentioned about my speech and speeches that I've made over the years, and he talked about the trust deficit in countries like the UK and the US, which have things like Ombudsman and Freedom of Information Act and so on and so forth. I'd like to ask the minister, would he agree that perhaps the trust deficit in the UK and the US and other countries which have those kinds of institutions that he's referring to may not be because of those institutions, it could be for other factors? And would he not agree that maybe if we took some of the kind of laws that we have in Singapore and applied it to those countries, it may not necessarily increase trust in those countries? And would he not agree that perhaps in Singapore, if we put in place laws that are a little bit more balanced along the lines that we've argued today in Parliament, that might possibly increase the trust levels that we have here, even though those trust levels you think are high? So that's sort of the third question. The fourth question is really, and the last one, is on the part of my speech where I talked about who checks the checkers. And I think it's a big subject. And essentially I asked, what recourse does a concerned citizen have in Singapore if they feel that very senior officials, Prime Minister, Minister of Home Affairs himself, has been suborned by a foreign power? I mean, what is their channel to redress that, to have that addressed? And as far as I could discern, the minister responded by saying that the form of redress would be the same as it is in other countries, which is that through other people. So actually, I'd like to put this back to the minister and say that, in the spirit of coming to Parliament, not with rhetoric, but with concrete and practical solutions, I mean, could he expand on really what is the redress in that kind of scenario, very, very practically speaking? Thank you.
First, on the first four questions. On the first question, 30 days, and whether there will be a time limit. It's difficult to commit to a time limit for the minister to respond simply because it depends on the facts and, the kind of evidence that needs to be assessed. But what we can commit to is that it will be done as expeditiously as possible. On the stepped-up measures, I explained it in my speech. I responded. On the trust levels, I think finally we're beginning to get to some narrowing of the gap. So let's agree. So you have all these institutions, freedom of information and the kind of media that they have, and the ombudsman doesn't automatically mean trust levels go up. In fact, trust levels have been declining. It may be because of other problems. And I think there's a kernel of accuracy in what Mr. Perera said. And the kernel that I extract is this. Each country has got to look at its own situation and decide what works for it. A country like China with 5,000 years and a single race, different considerations. A country like the US, different considerations. A country like Singapore with 700 square kilometers, different considerations. I think if we can agree on that, and that therefore we need to factor in what works for us, then the next question is, why have trust levels been so high in Singapore? They are very high. Why have they been high? There is a trust based on performance. There is a trust based on probity. There is a trust based on how leaders behave. There is a trust based on how powers are exercised. So anytime there is abuse, there is corruption, there is lack of probity, there is a performance deficit, trust will dissipate. And I believe in Singapore, it will dissipate very quickly because we are such a small place. Everyone understands everything pretty much in broad terms. Whether bringing in some of these institutions will add to trust is a conversation we can have as long as it's understood that, a priori argument, oh, if you have it, trust will increase. That's just not true. You have to ask, is it really going to? Why? Why do you say that? Or is it actually going to affect the performance of the government in such a way that actually trust will go down? Finally, who checks the checkers? I think Mr. Perera must be aware the CPIB can investigate anyone, including the Prime Minister. When the CPIB wants to investigate the Prime Minister, there is a higher authority they report to, independently. The CPIB can investigate me and any minister. And the man who was considered, or Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had publicly said, where will I get another Teh Cheang Wan? Because he solved the housing crisis. If you were to consider one of the inner core of ministers, Mr. Teh Cheang Wan would have been in the inner core of ministers. Powerful, heavyweight minister. What happened when there were allegations? Mr. Lee Kuan Yew told him, when Mr. Teh wanted to see him, I'm not speaking with you, let the CPIB investigate. That is Singapore. That is why our trust levels are high.
Mr. Leong.